This is Matthew McConaughey.
Natalie Portman.
James Patterson.
Michael Ian Black.
And you are listening to
5 Questions
with Dan
Schawbel.
Welcome to 5 Questions, Brian.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Well, it's been a long time coming, as I said. I've been wanting to do this interview for over 7 years. And I'd love to first start this out talking about, your childhood and the influence that your parents had on you. So both your parents were social workers. You were a true rags to riches story. What values did they instill in you and that have made you the leader you are today?
Because my parents are social workers, they had to assume that people were fundamentally good. They were interesting, and all you had to do was listen to their story. Everyone in that sense was kind of equal. Like there's no class system when you go speak to a social worker. And I think it also created this idea of rooting for the underdog. I remember my dad always always rooted for the underdog in a sports team. And my mom always wanted to hear someone's story and always assumed no matter what pain or what challenges someone had, that there was some redeemable quality. And so that really made me believe in these two almost preposterous ideas that started Airbnb, that people are actually fundamentally good and that we're 99% the same. And you just need to learn about people's stories. And you got to be able to help stick up for people, especially underdogs, especially people like our hosts, because we have 4 million hosts in our community. And our hosts remind me a lot like my parents.
Yeah, so it gives you a deeper level of empathy to them because of what you grew up with and your relationship with your parents. If they're struggling, especially now during, still a recession and a pandemic, you're going to be thinking about them more than maybe someone else who didn't grow up in that environment and maybe had more resources and was more disconnected and didn't have those values. And that leads me to the next question, which is the hospitality industry was one of the biggest victims of the pandemic. And I know this because my father is in the cruise business. So I have to file his unemployment. It's pretty tough, and it's been for a while, and he's booking people for over a year out right now. So it's pretty wild. Wow. And you and Airbnb reacted to COVID by creating online experiences, which was really smart, offering a $250 million support package to hosts and more. But can you talk about how you manage the mental and emotional hardship of navigating the crisis while overseeing thousands of employees and millions of hosts and customers worldwide?
Yeah, it turns out in a crisis, I think the hardest thing to manage is not the team or even the crisis. The hardest thing to manage is your own psychology. That's the hardest thing, because as a leader, if you think you're screwed, then you probably are. But if you actually think, this crisis is my defining moment, then you're going to see everything after that crisis as an opportunity. And in fact, Airbnb was born in a crisis where I couldn't afford my roommate to pay rent, but we saw it as an opportunity. And this past year, I saw this crisis as a moment when we would rebuild the company from the ground up, and everything after would be indelible marks. But what is that? That's mostly you managing your own psychology. Your thoughts become actions. And if you have an optimistic point of view, then your optimism becomes contagious in the company. And then suddenly, you can't be creative if you think you're doomed and you're afraid. It's really hard to be creative and afraid. And so in a crisis, you need creativity and resilience. And that requires a sense of optimism, not blind optimism, but something rooted in fact and first principle that actually has a redeeming quality to it.
I love that. And when I talked to my friends about Airbnb, they said, Airbnb did the right thing during COVID. They thought about their customers, that they thought about their employees. They didn't just think about their bottom line. In fact, it was a, sort of a sacrifice now for brand building and a deeper connection with people, everyone you touch globally. For me, I could never do what you do because, not only just to make payroll for so many thousands of people, but it's also all this weight on your shoulders, because if someone, in a different country is unable to, book people for their place, them being on Airbnb, that hurts them financially. So there's so much riding on you. Yeah. So the fact that you stay optimistic is so important because so many people count on you. And Airbnb has come a long way since you founded it and co-founded it back in 2008. I recently stayed at Airbnb in Miami. It was amazing, and it was such a good choice and experience for me. But if I said that to my parents that I was going to stay at an Airbnb a decade ago, they'd say, what's that? Or just stay at a hotel, it's safer, literally. What do you think originally led to the acceptance of Airbnb, and how has its growth affected how you live and relate to other people in your life?
Yeah, when we started Airbnb, I remember telling somebody about the idea, the first person, probably one of the first people, and they said, Brian, I said, yes. They said, I hope that's not the only idea you're working on. People thought this was the worst idea ever. If it was probably the worst idea that ever worked. And the reason why is people said strangers will never stay with other strangers. But what we created was not a way to book a home. We created a system of trust to allow strangers to trust each other at a global scale, unlike ever before. Obviously we had two-way reviews and profiles and a whole bunch of features that weren't possible before. And I think what started happening is we didn't get everyone to use it right away, but we got just enough people. And the way it works is you're basically building a community. No one wants to be the first person to do it, but once 100 people do it, then the 110th person, then 120th, and it creates a sense of social proof, like any adoption curve. But what we were is most adoptions are technology adoptions. Our adoption was more of a social behavior adoption. And what did it teach me? It taught me that despite what we read in the news every day, people can actually trust one another. And people are fundamentally good, and we have the data to prove it. So despite all the news you read, those are anecdotes, but hundreds of millions of data points later, people actually trust other people typically more than even brands and institutions once they know something in common with that person and they have a reputation. So that just unlocks tons of economic activity, $110 billion economic activity. But more importantly, it unlocks millions of connections. And before the pandemic, on a peak night, we had 2 million people a night living together from 220 countries and regions around the world. Never in history had that been possible. And it was only possible because of this system of trust that we created.
Yeah, and the word trust is so important. And as a society, there's a lack of trust. There's such a lack of trust. The Edelman barometer comes out every year, and it shows that trust continues to decline. Trust in media, trust in institutions, CEOs, just trust in everything. And I think that by thinking about Airbnb as a community and trying to instill as much trust as possible by doing the right things that we just discussed earlier, that can help you in the long term, because that everyone's searching for community. Community has kind of broken down in the past many years. And if you can be part of creating that ecosystem and community, you can really help improve people's lives, because that's what people are yearning for, especially post-COVID. People are going to be desperate for these type of experiences where they're connecting with other people in different places. And speaking of relationships and connecting, in my last book, Back to Human, which was published before COVID, I tell people to use technology as a bridge to human connection instead of letting it be a barrier that isolates them from others. And in the foreword you wrote for Airbnb's travel report, you emphasize this quote. You say, quote, technology has provided a means of digital connection, but this is more of a synthetic and less fulfilling than real human connection. I think the only thing that would disagree with us is robots, right? How have you used technology as a bridge to real human connection with your family, with your friends, your leadership team, and workers?
Well, I mean, to start with, we always thought of Airbnb, the platform, as a window into the world. Airbnb wasn't a replacement for human connection where you'd spend all your time online. It was a gateway to actually meet strangers from cultures and communities around the world. When the pandemic occurred, we created online experiences because we had to stop doing physical experiences. And online experiences, to me, are different than YouTube videos or Instagram. They're interactive. And so I don't think connections like this on Zoom are bad. I just think you need to create connections that create empathy. No one's ever changed someone else's mind in a YouTube comment section, but because there's no empathy, you can't see their expression. So what I did during the crisis is what everyone could do is, I mostly relied on Zoom, but in a time of crisis, one of the things I learned is you need to step up communication. I think this is the most isolating period in human history. How in human history could we have ever been as isolated and survived as we are today with the marvels of this technology? but what has kept our bodies alive has started to, I think, wear down our spirits. And so I've tried to just stay incredibly connected to as many of my friends and family as possible. The one silver lining for me in the crisis is so many people were worried about me that I actually got a lot of people reaching out to me, which was really like, I didn't feel very alone because so many people were reaching out, like pulling for us and rallying. And I don't think everyone had that experience, but I was very lucky that we got to feel all that like support and all that love. And I do think, though, I will say, the last thing I'll say is once it is safe to do so, I do intend to go beyond Zoom. And what do I want to do? I want to travel with the people I love and care about. I think that's the fundamental thing we miss. I think people miss travel, and I think people miss human connection, especially in the real world. If you can combine those two things, I think that's something we can help with. The silver lining is many people got closer to their inner circle, but I think everyone's bubbles have gotten smaller, and many of us have not made new relationships. And I think one of the sad things is as people age, they stop making new friends. A lot of their friends are, you can never stop creating new relationships in your life. The day you stop making new relationships, the day you stop growing, and the day you stop growing is the day you start dying. That's how I think. So I feel like one of the things I'm interested in is not just rekindling relationships with people I care about, but continually connecting with new people and thinking of it like kind of concentric circles of connections.
Yeah, I love that. My mom would agree with you. She believes you have to constantly make friends throughout your whole life. Whereas I have a lot of friends in New York that are like, these are my 5 people, and I'm not interested in meeting new people. So I think it's about attitude, and it's about diversity too. It's about, can I connect with people who are different than me? In your case, maybe different industries that you can learn from. And I think that can really, really help as well, because it's broadening your horizons. It's making you more creative and innovative. And in your industry, and I'll always remember this, I remember you spoke at the Fortune Brainstorm Conference years ago, and you said that every company will be a technology company that isn't already a technology company. And it felt obvious, but I was like, so no one said this. And this is exactly how people need to think. And so in order to be innovative, especially in technology, you need different voices. You need to be around different people. And what's 100%. Your best piece of career advice?
When I grew up, I remember my mom's a social worker, and my mom told me, I chose a job for the love and I made no money. So you should choose a job that pays you a lot of money. And I said one day, great, Mom, I'm going to go to art school at the Rhode Island School of Design. And she said, oh my God, you chose the only job that's going to pay less than a social worker. You're going to be an artist and you're going to live in my basement. And I said, no, Mom, I'm not going to do that. And she said, if you do graduate, you have to get a job with health insurance. And I did that. And then one day I called her and I said, I'm quitting my job. We have this idea called Airbnb. And she, my mom and my dad thought it was terrible. So my piece of advice for everyone is don't listen to your parents. Your parents love you. You should listen to your parents about relationships and love. Do not take career advice to your parents. And by parents, I mean parents and friends and guidance counselors and whomever. Just because someone loves you doesn't mean they know you deep down in what your passion is. So what I would follow, is your curiosity. I wouldn't even say follow your passion, because the problem with saying following your passion is it presumes you already know what your passion is. You have to discover it. And the only way to discover it is to take pressure off yourself. Don't worry about status. And by the way, I wouldn't try to get a job, choose a career that pays you well, because it's very possible whatever jobs pay you well today, technology will automate in 10 years anyway. There may not be any job security in the future, except to have something you're deeply passionate about, you're really good at. But the only way to be passionate about something is to be curious. So take pressure off yourself and be curious. You'll eventually find it.
I love that. And it makes me reflect on my interview with Ben Hurwitz, who said his piece of advice was, don't listen to your friends.
Exactly.
And I was like, oh, interesting. And he said that don't listen to your friends because the advice they're giving you is actually for them. Yeah. And I thought, and that was kind of a mind-blowing moment. And I thought that was really interesting. And then Mark Cuban has famously said, don't follow your passion, follow your energy.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, these are all great. And I think that maybe similarly, your parents sometimes want the life for you to live that they wish they lived for themselves. The two problems are, number one, you are different than your parents. Everyone's different. And so, that's bad. But the second problem is because you're born 20 or 30 years later. So whatever was a good career move 20, 30 years ago, like my grandfather was a printmaker. There's literally physically printing newspapers that doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, I think the only real job security is to just have to be really good at something you're really passionate about, and just that kind of transcends any era, like, and just constantly being nimble and being curious.
Love that. I appreciate the conversation, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much.